Hi everyone, I am Sean Christensen from TurboSource, and I will be walking you through the video on how to install the Turblown Engineering BorgWarner EFR internally wastegated cast manifold turbo kit. The tools you will need for the install are the following: a short and long 15mm open end wrench and a 10 and 13mm open end wrench, 11/16 open end wrench, a 1/4 inch ratchet with a 10mm socket, a 3/8 inch ratchet with a 16 and 18mm socket, and a 6mm Allen head socket, a 1/4 inch drive with an 8mm socket, a 4mm Allen head wrench. Lastly, it is recommended to have some anti-seize for some of the hardware installed, which will be shown at times in the video. Use the 10mm open end wrench to remove the wastegate canister from the turbo. In order to remove the canister, you will need to remove the two 10mm nuts that attach the canister to the wastegate bracket. Also, you will need to remove the 10mm nut that is at the end of the actuator rod. Use the 4mm Allen head wrench to remove the 3 countersunk nuts that secure the wastegate bracket to the turbo. The EFR series turbos come with 4 coolant ports. 2 of the ports are blocked off from factory. The ports from factory need to be switched around. On the side of the turbo that faces the passenger side of the car, the coolant block-off plug needs to be on the bottom hole. On the side of the turbo that faces the engine, the coolant block-off plug needs to be on the top hole. Note, these are very hard to remove. Use a 3/8 inch ratchet with a 6mm Allen head socket. Now that the coolant block-off plugs have been switched around, the black -6 fittings need to be installed into the coolant ports. The kit provides 2 of these fittings with 2 copper crush washers. Make sure to install the fittings with the copper crush washers or you may experience leaks. Use the 3/8 ratchet with the 18mm socket to install the fittings. Use the 13mm open end wrench to loosen up 5 out of the 6 turbine housing bolts. I like to leave the bolt that is closest to the oil feed tight, as it is easiest to reach when the turbo is inside the engine bay. Use the 1/4 inch ratchet with the 10mm socket to loosen up the V-band clamp that secures the compressor housing onto the turbo. Once the housing is loose, move the outlet of the compressor housing so it's oriented towards the top of the turbo. Note, you do not need to completely remove the V-band, just enough so that you can move the compressor housing freely. Install the cast manifold onto the engine with the appropriate gaskets. You only need 2 of the nuts installed because the manifold will be removed after clocking. Install the inconel stud kit into the cast manifold along with the inconel T4 gasket. Note, this will be shown later in the video. Install the turbo onto the cast manifold with 2 of the inconel nuts. It's best to use the top right stud and the rear bottom stud to secure the turbo to the cast manifold with the short 15mm open end wrench. Use a 13mm open end wrench to loosen the 6th turbine housing bolt. This will allow you to clock the center of the turbo. Clock the center of the turbo so the oil feed fitting is pointing up. While the turbine bolts are still loose, install the oil feed line. You will move the center of the turbo so that the oil feed line will easily install with your hands. Once the oil feed line has been secured down with your hands, use the 13mm open end wrench to tighten the top turbine housing bolt. At this point, you will also clock the compressor housing to meet up with your intercooler piping. Use the 1/4 inch ratchet with the 10mm socket to tighten the V-band that secures the compressor housing to the turbo. Now the compressor housing and the turbine housing are locked into place. Remove the oil feed line, the turbo, and the cast manifold from the engine bay. Use the 13mm open end wrench to tighten the rest of the 5 turbine housing bolts. Note, you will want to make sure that the tabs are resting on the center of the turbo so that they properly secure the center of the turbo to the turbine housing. Note, when tightening the turbine bolts, use a crisscross tightening pattern and spin the compressor wheel to make sure nothing is binding. Secure the BorgWarner wastegate bracket to the Turblown Engineering wastegate bracket adapter. Use 2 of the counter set bolts with the 4mm Allen head wrench. Note, when you are working on the turbo with the compressor housing down, be careful of the blow-off valve. It is plastic and can break easily. TurboSmart also makes a blow-off valve upgrade that is completely metal. Install the wastegate bracket assembly onto the turbo. The assembly fits in the gap on the compressor housing next to the oil drain part of the turbo. Use 2 of the counterset bolts with the 4mm Allen head wrench to secure the assembly to the turbo. Install the 5/8 inch O-ring flange with 2 of the provided Allen head bolts. Use the 6mm Allen head socket. Install the 5/8 inch rubber hose with the heat shield. Install the clamp over the shield. Use the 1/4 inch drive with the 8mm socket to tighten the clamp onto the heat shield and the rubber hose. Note, I did use a screwdriver to tighten the hose, but the 8mm socket works a lot better. Install the wastegate canister back onto the turbo. Use the 10mm open end wrench to tighten the two 10mm nuts that secure the canister to the wastegate bracket. Note, when you do install a canister, make sure the wastegate actuator rod goes inside the hole for the wastegate door arm. Install the 10mm nut at the end of the rod with your hand until it's lightly tightened. Mark the nut with a marker. Use the 10mm open end wrench to further tighten the nut at the end of the rod. We recommend starting with 4 turns of preload. The highest amount of preload recommended by BorgWarner is 7 turns. Once you have your preload set, tighten the front nut on the actuator rod tightly against the wastegate door arm. Note, it is very important you set your preload correctly, as it directly affects how fast the turbo spools along with how the boost is controlled. TurboSmart offers a dual-port wastegate canister. The reason for why you would want to install this canister over the OEM canister is that the TurboSmart canister offers many different spring configurations. Also, the dual port allows you to have a much larger range of boost between high and low boost. Note, it is important to make sure the actuator rod is not misaligned. If the actuator rod is misaligned more than the specified amount in this document from BorgWarner, you did not clock the turbo properly and you will need to reclock it. Briefly explained before, you will need to install the 4 inconel studs into the cast manifold. Lightly coat each of the ends of the studs with anti-seize. After that is done, you will want to remove the 1/8 inch NPT plugs from the manifold and apply some anti-seize. Then use the 4mm Allen head wrench to install the plugs back into the EGT bungs. Install the T4 inconel gasket. Note, if you are going to run EGTs, you can skip this step. Install the turbo onto the cast manifold. You will need to install all 4 inconel washers. Once all 4 washers are installed, you will want to install an inconel nut to the stud that is furthest away from the actuator rod but closest to the turbine housing outlet. The reason you need to install this nut first is because it is impossible to install after the other nuts have been installed. Note, it is a tight squeeze, but it does fit. Install the other 3 inconel nuts with the 15mm open end wrench. Install the second 5/8 inch O-ringed flange onto the front cover of the engine. The front cover from OEM has 2 studs that 10mm nuts fit onto. You can use a 1/4 inch drive with a 10mm socket to secure the flange to the front cover. Install the rear oil drain block-off plate. Use the 4mm Allen head wrench with the 2 bolts provided. Note, it is recommended to use a gasket or gasket sealer when installing this block-off plate. Make sure your engine exhaust gaskets are installed. Coat the engine manifold studs with anti-seize. Note, our inconel stud kits do work very well for this, but the washers would not be used due to the length available on the studs. Install the entire turbo assembly onto the engine. Secure the turbo assembly with all 4 nuts. Install the oil drain line onto the front cover flange. Make sure to put the clamp on first before pushing the hose onto the flange. Use the 1/4-inch drive with an 8mm socket to tighten the clamp. Install the blue oil feed fitting with a copper crush washer into the front iron on the engine. Use the 3/8 ratchet with a 16mm socket to tighten the fitting. Then install the oil feed line. Note, the long end goes onto the turbo and the short end goes onto the front iron. Use the 15mm open end wrench to secure the oil feed line. Install the FD heater core line. The long rubber hose end attaches to the water pump housing, and the short rubber hose end connects to the firewall. The heater core line comes with 4 clamps. Use the 1/4-inch drive with the 8mm socket to tighten the clamps. Note, FC owners, this line does not come with the kit. Install the 90-degree -6 fitting onto the short stainless steel coolant line with your fingers. There is 2 clamps that are used to secure the rubber part of the line to the lowest water pump housing nipple. Push the rubber line onto the lower water pump housing nipple, then tighten the clamps with the 1/4-inch drive with an 8mm socket. Then with your fingers, tighten the 90-degree fitting onto the black -6 coolant line fitting. Once the line is hand tight, use the 11/16 open end wrench to tighten up the 90-degree fitting ends. Install the 90-degree -6 fitting onto the long stainless steel coolant line with your fingers. There are 2 clamps used to secure the rubber part of the line to the top water pump housing nipple. Then tighten the clamps with the 1/4-inch drive with an 8mm socket. Then with your fingers, tighten the 90-degree fittings onto the black -6 coolant line fitting. Once the line is hand tight, use the 11/16 open end wrench to tighten up the 90-degree fitting ends. Note, this is the same nipple used for the throttle body, which is recommended to be deleted. If you continue to want to route the coolant to your throttle body, please run a brand new line to the middle nipple. Install the K&N air filter that is provided with the kit. Use the 1/4-inch drive with the 8mm socket. Note, depending on your intercooler/radiator setup, you may need to make a custom intake. Lastly, install the downpipe using the 1/4-inch ratchet with the 10mm socket. This wraps up the video, and I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough.